there's many different ways that we kind of wonder that. Initially, I hope to think that we don't stay there very long. But you know, we had Helen's brother, I think, sister-in-law was in a car accident this past weekend, wiped out the car, and now they're looking for some cheap transportation. I almost chuckled when she said this, but if any of you know some cheap, like $2,000 car that runs really well, let her know. I go, yeah, we could sell that car many times over. Everybody's looking for that. But you could think of our country, you could think of your medical conditions, of you or your loved ones, you could think of the financial conditions of you or your loved ones, you could think about the financial condition of our church, which is going to hurt because we're probably going to miss another offering this Sunday, and we'll probably have to put out, man, it's going to be well over $1,000 is one estimate so far to plow this parking lot. It's $450 just for salt, and then it goes by inch. So we're going to pay a gazillion dollars for plowing, and then no money coming in on Sunday. So is God in control? Why can't He have the storm come Monday? Can you guys just get more time off from work? Like, seriously, God, there's 7 days in the week. I just need one. So the struggle is, many of us ask if God is both powerful and holy, or if God is both powerful and sovereign, it should have been, or in control, then why is there so much suffering and evil in this world? So then the conclusion that most people come to is that either God is not good or God's not powerful. And that's about all your only options, I guess, really. I mean, if you're a believer in God. So I guess He's not in control, and Mother Nature is just steering this storm towards us this weekend, when it could have happened next Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, or something like that. In the book, on page 12, he talks about the providence of God. The Bible teaches we do have it both ways. God is sovereign, or providence, or all-powerful, or omnipotent, whatever word you want to use, and He is good. The Bible teaching on this subject is categorized under a subject we call the providence of God. God's providence is a term we use to acknowledge God's seeming intervention in our affairs. So, providence, and we'll look at it on the next pages here in the book, and they've got 13 Packard's definition of it. But providence, according to the Logos Bible software, is this, on your sheet of paper there. God's providence refers to His active involvement in directing events and circumstances towards His purposes. So it refers to God's active involvement in directing the protesting and the rioting in Minnesota, pick a country, what's going on in Ukraine, the circumstances, the snowstorm that's coming towards His purposes. Even when human intention or obstacles seem to work against those ends. The Ukrainians are really wearing out the lament psalms. I would too. I think their Bibles just automatically go to them, and as he texts me regularly, I really don't know what to say anymore. You know, we've been through the theology of suffering, we've been through James, we've been through Peter, we've been through Romans, we've been through Job, finally I just start saying, how long, O Lord, how long? I'm kind of running out of words of encouragement, because it's just devastating what they're going through. It's just absolutely horrific. And you kind of wonder, how is a good God, seems like these obstacles are working against these ends? Rather than distant observation, God's providence is His continued governance over creation and history, and we'll be looking at that as we go a little bit further into the book. So look on page 13, and the second paragraph where it says historically, drop down 3 lines. Well-known theologian J.I. Packer defines providence like this: the unceasing activity of the Creator, whereby, in overflowing bounty and goodwill, He upholds His creatures in ordered existence, guides and governs all events, circumstances, and free acts of angels and men, and directs everything to its appointed goal for His glory. And then again, this author notes his absolute terms. If you go down a little to the next paragraph, Packer's definition, go down 4 lines, and he says, the author, I've developed a more easier one. God's providence is His constant care for and His absolute rule over all His creation for His own glory and for the good of His people. Notice the terms constant care, absolute rule, all creation, His own glory, and the good of people. But then, His own glory and for the good of the people. So, just as we think again, Minnesota's pretty crazy what's going on over there. How can that be for His glory? The snowstorm, how can that be for our good? I mean, we don't own snowmobiles, I don't think, and we're not real big skiers, and we're not up in the Poconos, so I guess we're going to get some good exercise maybe, huh? Shoveling.
One way to look at it.
Yeah, I guess so, and then all these heart attacks that may come from it. So, but I want to, there is always struggles, friction, tension points in our faith. The theology of the Trinity, how does that actually work? How does the incarnation actually work? There's many tensions or friction points that we must have, because to completely satisfy them to our understanding, well, then we greatly diminish the import or the ramifications of Scripture. So we want to hold that in struggle. We don't want to discard one or the other. And because he says there in the first paragraph at the end of it on page 13, master of our fates, I'm almost positive he is referring to this poem Invictus, which is on your sheet of paper. And this is very important that you and I have to be aware of. Even like last week we talked about, if we're to live by faith, we kind of know how we do that at difficult days. But how do we do it on a nice sunny day like today? Even though it's stinking freezing cold. But how do you live by faith on the bright sunny days? Well, we don't want to fall into this, which is a complete opposite. William Henley says, out of the dark that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. In the fell clutch of circumstances, I have not winced nor cried aloud, probably not completely honest. Under the bludgeoning of chance, my head is bloody but unbowed by chance. Beyond this place of wrath and tears looms but the horror of the shade. It's got the horror right. We might want to use the word hell. And yet the menace of the years finds and shall not find me unafraid. It matters not how straight the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. That sounds a lot like the end of Revelation, doesn't it? I am the master of my fate, and I am the captain of my soul. So this would be someone who is definitely not at all in agreement with the providence of God. Chance, fate, and even though there may have been a God, as he makes a reference to it, the horror of the shade, the punishments of the scroll, he was not going to acknowledge it. Okay, so we're not going to go to that extreme, but we do have to figure out how do the bad things that happen in my life, how does that match for his glory and my good? And let's just keep moving on with the book a little bit. And if you want to look at the piece of paper there in front of you, it's on page 13. He says, God's providence has two objectives, for his own glory and for the good of people. And these two objectives are never in conflict with each other. These two objectives are never greater or lesser than another. They're all in balance. Because here's when you think it through, God never pursues his glory at the expense of our good, and he's not ever going to pursue our good at the expense of his glory. Okay, and so that sounds really good sitting in a nice sterile classroom like here, but as we start thinking it through, we're going to have to think this through a little bit. But there is one passage I think that maybe we should look at here, and we're going to look at a few more in here. But someone want to look up Deuteronomy 29:29? Because sometimes, and you guys know it, I don't need to say it, but I'm Captain Obvious. I'm not the brightest guy in the room, obviously. You've been around for a while. So there's sometimes I just can't really figure this stuff out. And when I look at my circumstances, I look at the circumstances around me, and I look at God's glory and our good, it just sometimes don't make sense to me. Carl, what's going on there, buddy?
Trying to figure out, did you say
Deuteronomy
29?
29.
29, 29?
Yeah.
What?
I have it here.
Thank you.
All right, go ahead.
The secret things belong to the Lord our God, but the things that are revealed belong to us and to our children forever, that we may do all the words of his law, of this law.
Mm-hmm. So there are things that are revealed, right? And we're to keep them, children, grandchildren. We must leave a godly legacy that our children or grandchildren are going to follow in. Great goal of life, a godly legacy. But then he says in the first part that there are secret things that belong only to God. So as we get into grief share here in February 2, if we've been able to plow out from this great snowstorm, I'm going to have to tell them as they're shaking their fist at God, crying, why? Although it's not going to be all that helpful. I need to do a lot more loving and carefully over 13 weeks, but you're never going to know. There are secret things that belong to the Lord your God. You don't have the access, you don't have the security clearance, you don't have the seniority, you don't have the intelligence. You're not going to understand. So we're not always going to be able to understand God's glory and our good in this. Pick one of the situations we just are praying about. There, let's go to David. David and Beth Ann. Oh my goodness, what is he going to do if he can't get strong enough to get in and out of a wheelchair? And then if you've been over to his house in Croydon that's not handicap accessible, he can't even get in his van. I mean, transportation is going to be a problem, going to the bathroom, the bedroom. What's he going to do? How's that going to be for his good? How is God's glory going to come from that? Well, the secret things belong to God, which then comes to our book. Are we just going to have to trust him? Because trust and understanding don't always match up. In fact, I don't think they are synonymous. All right. So any thoughts or comments thus far?
Yeah, I keep thinking the same thing. You know, Packer uses the words he upholds his children, his creatures in ordered existence. The author says his creation for his own glory and good of his people. So I wonder, do we have a level of free will?
Oh, yeah.
That's what I wonder.
And we do, and the men on Wednesday night, give us 13 weeks, and the men that show up at breakfast will be able to wax eloquently about that, because we're going to talk a little bit how free is man's freedom. But man is free, and let's go all the way back to the Garden of Eden. In the Garden of Eden, in an absolutely perfect environment and everything, God said, of all the trees you can freely eat, just not this one. Well, he gave them a choice. Well, what was the purpose of a choice if they didn't have a choice? So, yeah, man does have free will.
Yeah, that's a good example.
But here again, and this is very good, but God's providence or God's control is large enough to encompass, to guide and direct the free will of men. Another really good verse, because that's a good point. If God is in sovereign control, the one extreme then that we could fall into is hyper-Calvinism. God is the ultimate marionette, and he's pulling on the strings, and he's got the United States over here, and he's got Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia over here, and he's got Israel over here, and he's got Ukraine, and he's just pulling strings. But here's another good verse that shows us that man has choice, and that is in Galatians 4:4. Someone want to look up Galatians 4:4? And there's others like in the book of Acts that refer to it, but Galatians 4:4 is nice and short. Ken, do you have it already? My soul, you're good with that Bible reference there. Galatians 4:4 says,
But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive adoption as sons.
okay. All right, so kind of a trick question. Where is or when was the very first reference to the gospel, to salvation, to Christ's coming?
Cursing of Satan and the garden and the seed and bruising of the head and that.
Way back in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. You can look it up, but I think it's 3:15. In Genesis 3:15, we have what we call it doesn't matter what we call it. It's the first reference of the gospel in the Bible. Now, how old is the earth? Roughly, conservatively. We'll use our apologist over here.
According to the Bible or according to science?
About 6,000 years.
About 6,000 years. So 6,000 years, including our 2,000 now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So we got to back up 2,000 years. So if the earth was created about 4,000 years, this is where the fullness of time has come. God sent forth his Son. He took 4,000 years of, where you want to start with, the Assyrians, the Syrians, the Egyptians, the Alexander the Great, the Romans, and all those battles and everything to get everything exactly to the point in time of the birth of his Son. When the fullness, when everything was completely needed to bring forth his Son, he sent his Son. And you could argue that there's all kinds of free will in that, of all the empires and all the people, and Abraham as we're reading, and Lot as we're reading in the scripture. Yeah, all that kind of stories, they all made choices. So just another good example of how man has freedom, and God used that freedom in his sovereignty, Galatians 4:4, to bring it to the point where Christ would be born. Good thought, good comments. Anybody else?
Well, there's not a lot we can take from Henry. But I do think the Christian can look at that poem and see, he doesn't see his circumstances as defining himself. He sees he is defined by his response to those circumstances.
Yep.
And I think that's a key component to understanding God's sovereignty and our free will. We do not have the free will to form our circumstances. We do not have the free will to form the consequences of our actions.
Yep.
However, we do have the free will to choose our reaction. I personally think we see that in Pharaoh, when God hardens his heart. It was God's will for the people of Israel to remain in Egypt longer. So even though Pharaoh decided, God said, nope, you're going to decide something else. And I think Pharaoh will stand before God answering for other things, but not for his heart being hardened those times. And I know some people disagree with that, but it fits the text.
Yep. Yep. Yes, Carl?
So I'm looking on page 13.
Yep.
It says, nothing, not even the smallest virus escapes his care and control. And I loved reading this chapter because then I read on page 17, nothing. No one act outside of God's sovereign will or against it. No one can act outside of God's sovereign will or against it. Augustine said, therefore nothing happens unless the omnipotent wills it to happen, either permits it to happen or he brings it about himself. And I thought, you know what? Do I really trust God? You know, when things are going good? I don't think so. Yeah, no problem. But when things are not good? Now, hold on a second, right? Wait a minute. Well, do I trust his word? Because his word tells me that all things work together for good for those who love him, right? It's the good and the bad. I can't remember reading anywhere in the Bible that tells me that once you're a born-again Christian, life's easy. Everything's good. Everything's great. No, it doesn't say that. It says narrow is the gate and hard is the way that leads to life, right? It says you will be persecuted, right? You will face tribulation. Jesus said you're going to get it, you know? So it's not going to be easy. Do I trust him? Well, if I believe in what the Bible says, then yeah, I can trust him even when things are not good, even when things are bad. Do I believe that it's going to work for my good and his glory? Well, that's what he said. Do I trust him? Of course I do. Not always easy, but I do. You know what I mean?
Yep.
So, and I'm looking at this chapter, this whole chapter. I loved it. I think this is great because it just gives me that feeling of I can trust him no matter what, right?
Right. Now, we have to back up just a little bit because there's two caveats or two problems. Who defines good?
Mm-hmm.
And you know my definition of good: pain-free, problem-free, prosperous.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's one problem. Who's going to define good? And verse 29 kind of defines it, you know, conformity to his image. The other thing that we oftentimes forget about is that our existence here on planet Earth in this human body is such a small microscopic dot on the timeline of eternity that we don't even really exist. So good, for example, as I've been trying to encourage others in the past, it may not be good as we would like it here on Earth, but you have no idea the good that's going to come out of it that's going to benefit you for all infinity, for eternity, and that's a long time. So sometimes we forget that we are immortal beings and that we're going to live forever. And we get all caught up about, as he says, and we'll look at the pages there, about your car not starting or breaking down at the most inopportune financially. And we get all consumed with the little things that, as Tom Anders says, is all going to burn anyway. So, yeah, it may not work out for good here on earth. You know, my husband, as we've heard people in the past, you know, go down to the track and they lose hundreds of thousands of dollars and they will never ever recover. And they're always going to be in debt because of the spouse's sinful acts. Is it going to turn out for good here on earth? No. But how they respond to that, grace, mercy, etc., 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 will benefit them for all eternity. So yeah, they're going to die here on earth a pauper in debt, but when they get to heaven, it'll be a different story. It has the opportunity to be a different story. So we do fall into those two caveats sometimes. All right. So, but you know, on the questions on your sheet of paper there between page 13 and page 19, I have another question. So how do we accept God's providence when loss, hardship, heartache, sickness, injury, or death occurs? And you're going to have to wrestle with that yourself. You're going to have to come up with an answer, because as you just mentioned, Carl, you know, how do we do this? And as you continue to read the book, as you continue to pray, you'll come up with a good answer. Let me show you just a couple of verses that is very important on page 15. Again, talking about God's involvement in what he has created. He says there in Isaiah 40, the middle of page 15, he brings out the starry host one by one. He calls them each by name. Because of his great power and mighty strength, not one of them is missing. And there again, that is just spectacularly, you know, talk about mathematical perfection or trigonometry or whatever, how you can have these planets doing these huge, incredibly huge orbits, and they're exactly perfect. I mean, over 6,000 years, you'd think there'd be some bumper pool going on. Because just the minutest variation over 6,000 years could be really kind of catastrophic. But yet they're still just orbiting perfectly, and they're not playing bumper pool in heaven. Notice what he says there in, we should read. Well, it says basically the same thing there on bottom of page 15. He supplies the earth with rain, and we've heard that before. God sends rain on the just and the unjust. God will send all kinds of beautiful white snow. And as someone said, when God was making winter, he knew it was going to be cold and miserable, so he made the snow pretty. Unfortunately, that didn't come from me, but yeah. But he will send the pretty white stuff on the just and the unjust. Or maybe if we can pray, it'll just keep moving even further. He makes the grass to grow on the hills. He provides food for the cattle and for the young ravens when they call. You know, Psalm 145 says, the eyes of all wait upon you, and you give them their meat in due season. You open your hand, and you satisfy the desires of every living thing. And again, so far, we're doing okay, because someone mentioned, yeah, but what about illnesses? What about viruses? What about potential cancer? We're going to have to bridge that gap. That God's even involved in that instance as well. Yeah, let's look at some.
It kind of goes back, because I know, like, my mom, she died of cancer a little over a year ago, but, like, she survived cervical cancer the first time. She kept smoking, and they can't prove 100%, but when the cancer came back 7 years later, she ended up with started in her bone in her thigh, then went to her skull. They treated that, but it was the lung cancer that got her. And it's possible that if she would have stopped smoking 7 years before this came back, she would have been fine. So it was hopefully free will that made her keep smoking. Like my aunt saw what my mom went through, and she just stopped smoking.
Yep. Yep, good example. Thank you for that, Jason. Okay, we're going to page 16. I need someone to look up 2 Corinthians 9:10. I need someone to look up Psalm 31:15. 2 Corinthians 9:10, and then Psalm 31:15. Who's got it? Second Corinthians 9:10. Who's going to read that? You got it?
Yeah, sure, all I do is hover over it. I cheat. 2 Corinthians 9:10 says, Now he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will supply and multiply your seed and increase the harvest of your righteousness.
He's providing seed for the sower. It's all coming from God. And then what about Psalm 31:15?
My time is in your hand. Rescue me from the hand of my enemies and from my persecutors.
Yep. Yep. My life, my days are in your hand. So, halfway through that first paragraph, he says, did your car break down when you could least afford repairs? Did you miss an important meeting because the plane had mechanical problems? The God who controls the stars controls the nuts and bolts and everything else, as well as the plane. So God's in control. Because here's the problem, okay? And this is where we get into problems when we interpret the Bible allegorically. If the Bible doesn't say what it means and means what it says, then where do you draw the line? So we're going to say, okay, God is in control of the good things, but God's not in control of cancer, possible cancer, etc., etc. Well then, how do you draw that line, and how do you know the line doesn't move, and how do you know you drew the right line? You know, and who's going to decide? Usually, as we're going to see a little bit further, we decide on our own circumstances, which is a lousy criteria to base a decision. We'll see that on the bottom of our page. And again, let's look at on your piece of paper it says page 16. How did the author understand God's control when he was an infant and he had a bad case of measles? So, the middle of page 16, toward the bottom, someone want to answer that? How did the author understand God's control when he had infant measles and it damaged his eye and his ear?
Simply a victim of chance.
Is that what he said?
Mm-hmm.
He says,
Or was I, right,
Yeah.
or was he simply, okay.
Further down, he says, it leaves me no choice but to accept that the virus was indeed under his controlling hand.
Yep. And that's what I said before. You can't draw a line and be consistent that this is good and this is God's control, this is bad, this is outside of God's control. For one thing, then, we've lessened God's control that either he's not good or he's not powerful enough, and then second, like, it just doesn't work. So again, he has no choice but accept it was from his controlling hand. The last sentence there, if we are to trust God, we must learn to see that he is continuously at work in every aspect and in every moment of our lives. Because either he is or he isn't.
Bless you.
What do we got? We got 10 minutes. We better keep moving. We'll finish up. You know, just because he has some of the references here that are not laid out, you should look those verses up and read them. And I was going to do more reading, but we're running out of time. So bottom of page 17. God or chance? God or chance? The non-Christian, the bottom, last sentence on the bottom 17, for the most part has ruled out the creating act of God. That's true. We got Mother Nature, we got evolution, we have whatever they're espousing today, and his providence. For him, all events are in the hands of fate or chance, bad luck, dumb luck, bad karma, although that has some religious connotation. Just dealt a bad hand. Life has dealt me a bad hand, using the card playing analogy. Or Invictus, under the bludgeoning of chance. So that's really kind of a bad way to live, you know, throwing a little bit more religion into it, though it's not reverence to God. You got, you know, the bad karma, and reincarnation, and yeah, you should have lived a better life, and hopefully this one you'll do a little better. So go down to the last paragraph. Randomness, luck, chance, fate. This is the modern man's answer to the age-old question, why? Of course, if one dismisses the whole idea of God, as many do, then there's no other alternative. If there is no God, well, yeah, good luck with that. Whatever makes you sleep at night, I guess. Many, while not dismissing the idea of God, have fabricated their own speculations, such as the second paragraph of the book, when bad things happen to good people. Either God's not all-powerful, or God's not all-knowing, or God's not all-loving. Any of those combinations. And he talks then a little bit about deism. So, look at page 19, the second paragraph. Jesus said, "Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? And yet, not one of them will fall to the ground apart from the control, the sovereignty, the providence, omniscience, whatever word you want to put in there, of God." So don't be afraid, you're worth more than many sparrows. According to Jesus, God does exercise sovereignty over every minute event, life and death of almost worthless birds. I wish he would do that of mice and termites more so. The whole point, here's the point, if God exercises sovereignty over sparrows, then he exercises it in regard to, and I love this word, his children. What's the difference between us and unsaved? And I know that's a wide open, broad statement, but especially with the reference here of his children, when it comes to God's sovereignty, God's control, and all that stuff, God working in our lives. Anybody? And you're thinking, where's he going with this? All kinds of possibilities, but I would say that we are his blood-bought, adopted child. And usually, I would pay more attention to my own children than I would to Steve's children. Because in fact, so far, I've not yet met Steve's kids.
You probably asked us.
But my kids, when they were a little younger and that, if I heard Daddy, he would come running. So anyway, moving on.
At one time, Eric was really cute.
At one time he was little.
Okay, let's continue reading the middle, bottom part of that paragraph. While it is entirely true that God's love for us not protect us from pain and sorrow, my goodness, you need to underline that, highlight that. This is another thing I lovingly, patiently draw out in Grief Share. Show me where in the Bible they lived happily ever after. Maybe Enoch. Enoch walked with God and he was not, for God took him. It wasn't Elijah, that's for sure. He ended pretty cool, but life was pretty hard. I mean, there's no way. There's no perfect marriage. There's no perfect families. There's no perfect children. It's all broken. So I think, as maybe you said there, someone back over in that corner said, God never promised us pain-free, problem-free lives when we got saved. In fact, the opposite is, hey, if they killed the shepherd, what in the world do you think they're going to do to the sheep? I mean, you got to be kidding me. But it brings in lots of money for some of these people on TV.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it is also true that all occasions, this is going to be hard for some of us. It is also true that all occasions of pain and sorrow are under the absolute control of God. So thus then we lament like David in Psalm 13. How long, O Lord, are you going to forget me? How long, O Lord, will you hide your face from me? How long, O Lord, am I going to be in this miserable condition? How long? If God controls the circumstances of the sparrow, how much more does he control the circumstances of his loved ones, whom he died, his redeemed, the ones that have the imputed righteousness of Christ on them? God doesn't walk away and leave us to mercy of uncontrolled random or chance events. So then, on page 19, how then should we understand the forecast storm for the weekend? Mother Nature is just kind of putting it all together, right? Is God in control?
Yep.
And again, this is kind of easy because he sends the rain on the just and the unjust. And we just read earlier there in the Psalms and Chronicles where God controls the weather.
The snow will melt and the food will grow.
Yep. Okay, any questions while I'm turning to page 20? Any comments?
A lot of these questions fall on one common theme, man's attempt to understand God. And when someone claims that God is either this or that, they're putting themselves in some level to understand Him.
Yep.
But we can't understand
Right.
God. So, I think when people make comments like that, they're just being ignorant. When they're trying to exert some measure of control over God, when they're trying to say that He's either this or that.
Yep. And that's what we did way back from the Garden of Eden. I'm going to be independent, I'm going to be autonomous, and I'll do what I want. So I'm going to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
I don't mean to be insulting to us, but we act like little babies, little children, right? We started off with Rabbi Kushner, and the whole thing is, you see, even with some of the questions you asked, we don't know what we deserve. We think we deserve everything we want. God should spoil us like the little children we act like. They should give us what we want. We deserve, we broke the law of an infinitely holy God. The first time we sinned, we should have gotten punished.
Yep.
But He's long-suffering.
Yep.
And we don't sit there and say, why is He so long-suffering with us when we continue to sin?
Yep.
No, we say, why didn't you give us what we wanted? Somehow He's not good
Yep.
when we didn't get what we wanted as if we're God, which is, what Edward was saying, right? And yet, what do we deserve? We definitely don't deserve the breath in our lungs.
Nope.
We absolutely don't deserve heaven.
No.
So the fact that we even are breathing, we should be thankful to God for.
Yep.
And R.C. Sproul has a book on suffering, and it really was helpful. He talks about a vocation of suffering, and I never thought about it that way. That there's some people that God allows to suffer greater than others because it puts His glory on display. Because even in their suffering, instead of complaining and going, woe is me, they glorify God, and they do it better than me because I'm not suffering like that.
Yep. You're right. Very good. So we're going to end tonight on the bottom of page 20. Bottom of page 20. The last paragraph. In fairness to this writer, she suffered excruciating pain for months. As one who has suffered less severe pain, and that only for several weeks at a time, I realize that I have not sat where she sat. I have not wrestled to the degree that she has wrestled with the love of God in the midst of unbearable pain. Here's the point, I think, that Edward was trying to say. But as so often has been observed, we are to establish our beliefs by the Bible, not by experience. However, for most people and many Christians, they establish their beliefs by their experience, not the Bible. And here again is the fundamental proof. Never would we ask God why if we were building our belief system based on the Bible. Never would we question the love of God if we were building our belief on the Bible. However, being frail people, we do it by experience, and when the experience doesn't go our way, as what Andrew said, then we say God's not loving because it's not what, where, when, how, etc. as I want. So that's a very key point. I have that highlighted in yellow. I have a big exclamation mark on it. You need to dog-ear that page. That's a very critical part. And again, in the second paragraph on page 20, and then I'm done. Second paragraph, or the first full paragraph on page 20, author Margaret Clarkston. We admit that we are often unable to reconcile God's sovereignty and the goodness in the face of widespread tragedy or personal adversity. Yes, I get that. That's the beginning of the lament psalms. All the lament psalms start out with the question marks. Here's what Jesus said on the cross, right? 22, my God, why? Okay, so I get that. But, as Edward again very wisely said, but we believe that, although we don't often understand it, and we can't make it fit well to our understanding, we still believe that He's sovereignly at work in all of our circumstances. So, yeah, I guess God does have this. God's got this. And we're just going to have to trust Him. That's why Proverbs says, lean not on your own understanding. You can't understand it and live by faith. Because faith is the evidence of things not seen. We walk by faith, not by sight. You can't have it both